so glad to be here. I'm glad it didn't snow since I drove from Madison. And it has been a privilege to be part of this project since its early days. So it means a lot. I had a really interesting experience in doing some further research because I didn't know very much about Czechoslovakia or Prague in particular. And because I am of Jewish heritage, so it always touches someplace in us that's very deep. You just turn that up.
I just turned it up slightly.
Okay. So I am going to largely read this, but if you have any questions along the way, feel free to stop me and I will do some sort of more ad lib or on the spot comments as well. So, if you haven't seen the exhibit, by all means do, because this talk is almost set up as if you have already seen it, but I think you get the general outlines of the fact that they tried to get, and I'm going to call her Hetty since that was the name she was colloquially known by, and I have a Hetty in my own life, so I feel familiar with her. So they sent, Hetty's husband sent drawings of her designs, these drawings, to his cousin in Milwaukee with the hope that they would be able to claim that she needed an affidavit of necessity to come to the United States and would get them out of Europe, but it didn't happen. It didn't work. And so this is what we have remaining. So when Paul Strnad sent his wife's drawing to his cousin in Milwaukee, he was hoping that an American dress manufacturer would find her flair for fashion compelling enough to provide that very affidavit of necessity, and the couple could come to the U.S. We're not sure, at least I'm not sure, exactly what steps were actually taken to secure that affidavit, but we do know the application was turned down. And this is despite there being nearly 1,000 unfilled places in the annual quota of Czechoslovakian immigrants that year. So the tragedy is really obvious, and it's certainly at the heart of this exhibit and this project, but it's not what I'm going to dwell on today. Instead, let's assume, just for the purpose of this discussion, not because we know it's necessarily true, that the rejection was based on Hetty's true value as a designer or dressmaker in this country. And we don't have much to go on. It's these 8 images, but that's what we have. And actually, since we've started this, a little bit more information has come in because her niece was discovered. So there were a few more little pieces of information, but there isn't much to go on. But given that little bit, I am using them to assess her place in the fashion world at that time and understand also some more things about Jewish life and fashion in pre-war Prague. So in order to get into that, I'm going to first give you a little bit of information about the production of clothing in the fashion world overall in the late 1930s. And I want to do that partly to grapple with somewhat ambiguous terminology. So prior to the 20th century in the West, almost all women's clothing was handmade and usually cut and fit for a specific person. So there were specialists who made the clothes, tailors who usually made menswear, and dressmakers who made women's wear. And there were also milliners and haberdashers who produced hats, as a side note. They usually weren't the same people. So a given woman, and these go back further, of course, than the 20th century, but just to show that this tradition is long with us. A given woman might make clothes for her own family if she had enough skill, and that would include her own dresses, the underwear for the family, her husband's clothes, and so forth. But if she didn't have that skill, or if she was wealthy enough not to spend her time and her energy at that laborious work, she would go to a professional, and this was a dressmaker. Dressmaking also, it's very interesting because it is the primary way that women were able to support themselves, either setting up small shops or working out of their homes. And maybe you even know about the Elizabeth Keckley, I think it was, who was Mary Todd Lincoln's dressmaker, and there's been a book written by a Wisconsin author about her. And she rose up from a very, I don't think she was a slave, but she rose to a very prominent position because of her dressmaking skills. But in any case, that's a digression. The women would look at each other's clothes or at pictures in magazines, not way early, but by the 18th century, and then they could determine the style they wanted. And the customer would have to shop for the fabric and the thread and the trim, and she would get them by choice. So there was always this sort of collaborative relationship between a customer and a dressmaker. And garments were always made to fit specific bodies. So this whole idea of the dressmaker was very important. And the image on your left is a little sort of not quite belonging, but they're real dress forms from Hollywood, showing that they were made for specific bodies. Maybe you can see Shirley Temple is among them and so forth. But if you had a relationship with a dressmaker, an ongoing relationship, she might indeed have a form for you. Oh, I should have gone back to that one if you like that one. So in the middle of the 19th century, there was a new phenomenon that arose, and that was where clothes making and fashion was offered in a less personal, more business context, started by men. And entrepreneurial designers opened fashion houses. Charles Frederick Worth is considered the first father of haute couture, which is literally translates to high style sewing, but it's usually known as high style clothing. And so he designed a collection, and they were predetermined styles. They weren't collaborated with him. He said, this is my collection for the year, and you can come and have one fitted. But he had models. It was a real business with advertising and a whole range. And the fabric was pre-selected and so forth. So this is a new phenomenon in 1858 was the year. That's his establishment in Paris, and one of the labels from his gowns. So these were the most prestigious clothing in the European world, but even Americans sometimes got Worth gowns if they went overseas. So those who owned fashion houses like these had a host of people working for them. They had illustrators, cutters, stitchers, embroiderers, models, the marketing people. So it was a real large-scale business. Now, although we throw that word around a lot, there's only a handful of true couture houses that still exist today. But before World War II, I'm sorry, there were many more, especially in Europe, and that includes Prague, as we'll see. I'm a little behind myself, so some of the Worth gowns. So at approximately the time of World War I, manufactured or ready-to-wear clothing became widely available, and very quickly it became the most common form of fashion, especially in the US. Obviously, it's much easier to get something that's already made to order, and you don't have to go for fittings and so forth. And in this model of the manufacturer, it was the manufacturer who hired a designer, and then, like the couturier, they would develop collections on a seasonal basis. But the clothes were made en masse in the factory, although individuals still had to stitch them together, as they still do today. So these were, of course, the least expensive clothes, and typically the least innovative. In the 1930s, when Hetty was working in Prague, all of these contexts existed. A woman could buy a ready-to-wear garment, she could go to an independent dressmaker, or she could even go to a couture house, of which there were many in Prague, where she would be individually fitted for the very latest style. So the interwar Prague couture scene was very lively and renowned. The Czech couturiers regularly visited Paris fashion shows, and they purchased the right to reproduce designs, or they might have made their own adaptations, and they brought back fine fabrics and trim from Paris. But Prague couture was very well known, especially for precision and craftsmanship and elegance, and it was completely in style with current international trends. But it did seem to maintain a particular unique flavor, but I don't have a clear enough feeling about that to share it with you. So these couture garments were certainly expensive, and they were in high demand. This is from that same book. The new nation of Czechoslovakia, new at the beginning of the 20th century, was forward-looking and modern, very self-consciously so. And as Jana Ulipova, if I'm pronouncing it right, who worked for Prague's Decorative Arts Museum, and she explains that the city's rapidly developing high society required clothing that expressed and symbolized those European ambitions. So they wanted to become like Paris, and very cosmopolitan. And there was also a film industry in the country at that time, which was also really part of this new international cosmopolitan modernism, and it was inextricably tied to fashion. From the early 1920s, the very early days of cinema, the Czech movies referenced the fashion scene. They had dressmakers' salons pictured, and department stores, and dressmakers, and seamstresses, and so forth. So it was film actresses, rather than society ladies, who became the fashion role models, the role model style setters, essentially. And that's an interesting story, too, because the actresses sometimes blurred what they got in, like from a couture house if they could afford it, or a dressmaker, and wore it in the film, so that it wasn't quite as separate as it might have been in Hollywood at the time. But when, dark periods of persecution, lots of pogroms and being pushed out and so forth and so on, and not having full legal rights. But despite that, and they were only granted full citizenship in 1867. But all along, from the 10th century, they had been in the clothing business. I don't have particularly Prague images, but if you search for images of Jewish clothes makers, you get really an onslaught of the image of the Jewish tailor. So tailoring and dressmaking have long been understood throughout Eastern Europe as Jewish professions, and entire families were commonly engaged in clothing production. Jews were most associated with mending and selling secondhand clothes. And one of the things I read said this is possibly connected with the money lending business, which is part of our history too, because pawned clothes had to be kept in very good repair. But I don't know if that's actually true. So competition with Christian tailors' guilds was very intense, so intense that it's considered one of the variables in the 1745 expulsion of Jews from Prague. That expulsion didn't last too long. They were able to come back 3 years later. So approximately 1,400 families returned in 1748, and a fifth of them worked with the clothing business. So I wasn't going to read you the whole statistics, but they did all the jobs. They were tailors, menders, button makers, trim makers, merchants, and so forth. And so that was in the 15th century. So they did come back to Prague, and they settled their own district, which originally had high walls that the Jews put up for their own protection. And it became named after Joseph II, who granted new rights. This is another wonderful image of it. Yeah, and by the time that Hedy Snod was active, most well-off Jews were not living there anymore. It was for poorer people. So over time, as conditions changed and more rights were granted, Jews became increasingly prominent in aspects of the garment trade that they hadn't been before. They were marketers. Yes, we still are. The entrepreneurship led to the rise of 19th century factories. It was a Czech Jew, Meyer Mandel, who opened the first clothing factory in Europe in 1859. So that's really early, and it's just about the same time as the couture house I mentioned before. He employed dozens of tailors, and he supplied uniforms for the whole Turkish army and armies from other Balkan countries. So it was a big business. And by about 1900, when Hetty Strnad was born, there were several Jewish families that had established couture houses that became vital parts of Prague society. Some of those actresses who were the style leaders actually did act as customers for these. They patronized them. So despite all the waves of anti-Semitism that continued, these were a strong part of that new modern identity of the city. Now, according to her niece, Hetty was a, quote, lady tailor who ran a dressmaking shop. And this wasn't uncommon. Several Jewish memoirists tell of the shops from Prague and related places, tell of the shops that their ancestors operated, sometimes out of their homes. And dressmaking was not only considered women's domain, an accepted Jewish women's domain, but it had some prestige. So this is an image of another girl. She was even younger than Hetty, but her name is Margaret Meissner, and she was the daughter of a wealthy Jewish banker. And her mother sent her to dressmaking school in Paris in the 1930s, not only because Paris was considered safe, but the profession was suitable even for the most sophisticated, wealthy Jewish girl. So given all of this kind of background with the different levels of where fashion might be, what are we to make of Hetty Strnad's petition to come to Milwaukee as a dress designer? So you can see the letter upstairs in the exhibit and the text of it. And it's interesting to learn first that in response to the request, Alvin Strnad, the one who was in Milwaukee, approached a dress manufacturer, i.e. a producer of ready-to-wear garments. In America, a manufacturer's name sometimes actually substituted for a designer's. People would not only talk about a Chanel garment, for example, but they might cite a company name like Catalina, which was already in existence then. So we can't be certain that Strnad was using the term accurately, the term manufacturer, or that the manufacturer was himself Jewish, but it's not unlikely. American Jews were very important players in the industry in this country in the 1930s, as I'm sure many of you know. The center of production was certainly in New York, on or around 7th Avenue, and that was ready to wear. It was the innovative place for the world, really, but American manufacturing was the forefront of ready-to-wear. And Judith Weller's bronze statue of a yarmulke-bedecked garment worker now graces this area. It's called the Garment District. It's a tribute to the many Jewish laborers who were there. So you can see that today. There were clothing production companies in the Midwest as well, including some here. Jack Winter and Company and Rhea Manufacturing were here in Milwaukee, and I just saw in the exhibit downstairs some of the very early knitting manufacturers before 1900. Are you in that family? Right. So again, that was pretty quick, or pretty early for manufacturing, and I think knitwear even preceded other kinds of garments. But ready-to-wear clothing was more acceptable here than it would have been in Prague or on the continent. And as a side note, Jack Winter was one of the first manufacturers of women's slacks and set a lot of sportswear trends. And the Rhea Company was also one of these sort of fashion-forward institutions at the time. And Jerome Chazen, who's the current head of Liz Claiborne, which I'm sure you've heard of, was in that family. And Liz Claiborne herself worked at that company. So it comes around. In any case, we go back to Hetty. We don't know what her training was, although I would surmise that it was most likely informal. And we don't know how much time she spent sketching the designs that others had patterned out and sewed. Her drawings are certainly quite competent, but we don't know if she did it. We don't, in fact, know how much she actually functioned as the actual designer. It meant she had a shop. People worked for her, a few people. But she was certainly interested in keeping up with fashion trends, as the letter that came to Milwaukee specifically requested some fashion journals. She couldn't get to them anymore, and she wanted to be informed about what was happening in Paris. So we have to look at the sketches themselves. So the images sent to America, the ones you see here, they didn't have these bright red backgrounds, but they show well in that way. They were very much in keeping with the trends of the time. They did not depict unusual or even memorable women. Rather, the models were bland, kind of generic stereotypes that represented a kind of every woman ideal. A very white, often blonde in her pictures, every woman. The garments weren't that memorable either. They do not imply great luxury or the kind of style that the film stars, the fashion leaders, would have found in couture. And just as a kind of a contrast, and this is admittedly at the other extreme, but the daring contemporary designs were coming out at this very same time. So Elsa Schiaparelli was known for her shocking line, including a shocking perfume, and these were much more avant-garde, and they were purposely playing with shape and reference and material. So they would make you look twice. They weren't just pretty clothes. There were quite a few versions of that hat, actually. Other couture designers were known for exquisite drape or cut. Hetty's outfits were flattering, and they were, as I say, largely up to date, but they echoed the kind of illustrations one would find in a much more modest fashion magazine. So her sketches include what looks to me like minor outdated elements. She seemed to like floral prints. Again, we have a small sample, but that didn't match the real sort of top of the line emphasis on geometrics. That was what was really dominating everything from high style to ready to wear in the late 1930s. And her high round necklines were also not typical. Again, we don't have very many to go on. Now maybe these details reflected the fact that she didn't have access to up-to-the-minute imagery, or maybe it was local preference. I really don't know. We know that the one photo we have of her, it's undated, but it shows her wearing a similar high neck, although interestingly it has a bit of a geometric stripe too. But the design sample that was sent to Milwaukee doesn't feature sportswear or trousers. I mean, it's really middle of the road is what I would say, and these were already coming into style. But everything was in keeping. We see the same kinds of jaunty tilted hats, sometimes with a feather. An emphasis on the shoulders and upper sleeves. So I'm always showing you hers and something you see from another source. More of the shoulders. Even in the gowns. And then there were body skimming garments that fit not too tightly, not overly cinched, but definitely. The figures are anonymous, without personality. They don't look directly at the viewer. They stand in a narrow range of stylized postures. One hand bent at an angle, and the other straight down, as you can see in a few of these. Or in this sort of clasp pose with two hands clasped. It was interesting because when I looked at the exhibit, I was almost expecting the mannequins to be in these poses. The bodies are, and they're not, the bodies are kind of scaffolds, if you will, that the clothes will wear, and they're rendered in simple outline form, kind of reminiscent of paper dolls. So the sketches, and indeed the poses themselves, also recall the kind of fashion drawings put out by pattern companies who provided generic images to highlight the smartness of their products. And in America, you can find images like these in sewing magazines, monthly sewing magazines put out by companies like Buttericks. Hetty's sketches also show a familiarity with fabrics and the way they would hang and fit or drape or hug the body. So the coats and suit dress show them on the body, the way she's rendered them on the body a little differently than the day dresses, which would have been made out of different materials, or than like rayon or cotton, or the evening wear, which would probably be silk or possibly rayon. And even if her small shop did not work in multiples, which is what I think it did not, I think it was 1-to-1, these clothes look simple enough to be made in quantity and could have been adapted to a ready-to-wear market. So had she come here and gotten a job with a manufacturer, she probably would have fit right in. And I'd also like to look at what the fashion images tell us about the iconic European woman, American too, but Europe is where the styles were more set, in 1939. So she was young, slim, small-waisted. But of course, a fashion drawing is never realistic. In fashion drawings, they're very tall too, but there is a very definite look where you see the body, which had not been true in the 1920s. So she had reclaimed her essential curves. Remember the 1920s with the flapper image, very geometric and flat? But by this time, I think I might have missed one. Oh yes, this is what I want to show, the curves with the undergarments. Okay, so that had not been true a few years before, and we don't have time to go into all of that, but she was a feminine woman, and she was modest, but not retiring. She regularly appeared in public, which hadn't been true 40 years before, and she would show her face and her legs, and she was wearing makeup. And some of the time she reflected the efficiency and professionalism of the workplace, especially, see that in those images. And the suits often had detailing that was very similar to military uniforms, actually. But even when she was dressed more playfully, the broad shoulders evoked strength and kind of confidence. We think of the movie heroes from the movie heroines of the 1930s, and she's a kind of together woman. That's what we see in the clothes here too. She didn't have to do physical labor. There are no work clothes or practical shoes in the samples that we're looking at. And she wears dainty gloves. But she did have to labor at her appearance, taking time to roll or perm her hair into the neat face framing style and apply lipstick and rouge. And she cared about having the right outfit for the right occasion and the right accessories. She had leeway in her choice of hat, but she always wore it at the proper angle. So even if she chose, let me just go back there for the hats, you can get a sense. So even if she chose to wear ready-to-wear clothes, or she sewed them herself, she could look sophisticated and very much in the know, and that was a really democratizing fact with the 20th century, that you could look pretty much in style whether you had a lot of money or not. So she was modern and independent, in other words, and she didn't broadcast religious or ethnic difference, but she conformed to conventions and sartorial rules. So Hetty's designs show her to be a woman completely assimilated into this international cosmopolitan style. She was producing her designs for up-to-date women, probably most of whom had been very assimilated themselves. There's one image I was able to find. It looks like the late 30s based on their clothes, and you wouldn't pick these people out as Jewish or not Jewish. And they're well dressed even to take their children out. Better than we would be today, for sure. So images like this reinforce that this was a really cosmopolitan world that she lived in, and it's a cosmopolitanism that thrived even in the light of worldwide economic depression. Let's not forget that the 30s was the Depression. And it's really amazing also to realize that it had only been a century since Prague Jews had largely been in the ghetto, and since they had full rights. And so in middle of the 19th century to approximately 1940. So this fashion story, as you know, ends, oh, that's old, ends tragically, and ironically as well, because the city was emptied of most of its Jews, and this meant that the greater part of its skilled fashion workforce was gone after the Holocaust. And Prague had great trouble rebounding as a fashion center. And the final death blow was brought about by the Soviet takeover in 1848, because private companies, including fashion houses or even dressmakers' businesses, were converted to cooperatives and state enterprises. Sorry. So, in sum, there's an enormously rich and sad story here. And it's true, if we take the Stronad's petition for entry to the United States at face value in terms of Hetty's importance as a dress designer, she probably would not justify a special affidavit of necessity. She was competent, but she wasn't exceptional. Or that's my assessment anyway. Her designs were upbeat and attractive, and she was skilled. And I'm sure she was successful as a dressmaker on that particular level of the fashion business. But again, not enough to warrant special treatment, assuming that's the real reason. We really can't know that. We can only mourn the loss of her potential and the vitality of her life, as indeed we mourn the loss of all others who were shipped off to the Nazi camps. And we can also mourn the lively, forward-looking, cosmopolitan scene that existed in Prague before the war, and the strategic role that Jews played in cultural and economic life. So I've covered